In this video, we're going to analyze the effect of imposing a tariff in the domestic market when the country imposing that tariff is a large country. In the previous video, we did the analysis for a small country, and by definition, we said a small country is one that just takes the world price of the good that it is importing, or as we'll see, alternatively, for good that it's exporting, takes that price as a given. Well, the alternative, what we call a large country, is a country which will or can impact the global price of the good. So what does that mean in terms of our supply and demand analysis? Now again, coming back here to our world market, that means that effectively the tariff-imposing country, and we're sticking with the U.S. as being the home country here, that the U.S. is facing an upward sloping export supply curve. And so we'll start off with, just for the sake of being able to more easily compare the two scenarios, we'll start off with a world price of 300, just as we had before. And again, we had 1 million bicycles imported per year. And as before, we're going to take the equilibrium price that's found in our global or world market here. I'm going to draw that back into the U.S. market. Okay? And so again, we're just using the same numbers that we had before, at least for the initial setup. Okay. And once again, we can use the same tariff level. Okay? So we're going to do a $30 tariff, just as we did before. And just as we did when we were looking at the tariff with a small country case, we're going to shift the supply curve up by the amount of the tariff. Right? So we'll shift the tariff, or shift the supply curve up by $30. So if you think about it, really now this intercept here, right, this would become $255. And again, it's for the same reasons as discussed before, because the tariff, which is really just a tax, but a tax on imported goods, is raising the cost for these producers of selling into the U.S. market. So what's happening in this case? Now notice, right, notice what's happening here. Remember, we're saying that this gap between these two supply curves, right, so if I go straight up from 1.0 million from the original export supply curve to the new curve with the tax, right, with the tariff, that distance is $30. But where's the new equilibrium price? Well, that occurs where supply intersects demand. And that's occurring here at this price, which, as you can see very clearly, is below 330. And in the example in our book, that new price here is going to be given to us as I'm just going to make up my own numbers here that I like better than what the book has, actually. All right. I'll say that here, say it's 315 and 285. It's a little bit easier to see if we make it a little more balanced. Okay. So what's actually happening here? Well, this means that, right, instead of going up all the way to 330, right, the price of bicycles coming into the U.S. is actually only going up to 315. Right. But remember, again, if you take the distance between these two supply curves is the amount of the tariff. So if you go down from here, right, from 315, you go down to the old supply curve, that's subtracting out 30, what gives us that 285, right? So the way I've illustrated the example here, it looks like there's about an equal split here, is that the consumers are bearing half the burden of the tariff, the tax, since the price is going up by $15, and that the exporters are bearing the other half of the burden, the other $15 of the tax. So what does that mean in here in terms of our analyzing the welfare changes? Right. Well, from the perspective of the US, right? So let's start again. We start with our consumers, right? We always start just for the sake of consistency. What is happening to our consumer surplus? Well, just as before, we need to focus. What we need to focus on here is what's actually happening to the price in the U.S. market, and it went from 300 to 315. Right? Its consumption is going to increase, or rather, production is going to increase, and consumption is going to decrease. Okay? And I'll just say it's something like that. Okay, 0.7 and 1.5. So what's happening to our consumer surplus? Well, again, before we had this triangle, right, this area below the demand curve down to the price of 300 and all the way out to 1.6 million. Now consumers are just left with this smaller triangle, the area below the demand curve down to the new price of 315. So again, they end up losing these areas that we're labeling A, B, C, and D. Right? Very much the same thing that we saw before, just the size of the areas is a bit different because the price increased by less. Right? So they're losing A, B, C, and D. Right? What about the change in producer surplus? Well, producers are gaining A, just as before, right? The price went up. They're going to increase their quantity supplied from 600,000 to 700,000 bicycles. So that's also the same as before. Now where it gets a little different is when we're taking a look at the government's tariff revenue. Remember, the government is collecting $30 per bicycle. But when you look at the original price of 300, right, what was our world price, and compare that to the new world price with the tariff, right, that new price is up at 315. So when you're finding the total tariff rate, you have to go down $30 all the way to 285. So that means that tariff revenue is actually not just C, but C plus E. So what do we have? Consumers lose A, but that is just a transfer from consumers to producers. And while they also lose C, that is just a transfer from the consumers to the government in form of the tax, the tariff revenue that they're paying, right? Or at least their portion of the tariff revenue. So now we're left with E minus B and D. Well, B and D are, again, our production and consumption distortions, just as we had in the scenario where we were dealing with a small country. But now we have this extra area, E. And that is what we call our TOT, our terms of trade effect. What is that really representing for us? Well, it's representing the fact that part of the tariff revenue is coming actually at the expense of the exporters. It's a lot easier to see that when we come back into our world market here, our graph on the right. So C is this rectangle, right? So our imports drop from 1 million to 800,000. So C is this upper half of that rectangle, and then E is, right, this whole rectangle here, the lower half. Right? You can see that here, right? The price is only going up by $15. So this part of the tariff revenue, that area E, is actually coming at the expense of the foreign producers. Right? And again, B and D, right? So if you look at in the global sense. So what's happening here, right? You have this deadweight loss, right? So here's the demand for imports. So in this market, right, the U.S. the consumers who are importing, right, they're the consumers. So what happens when the price goes up is that the consumers, in this case, the change in consumer surplus is minus B, C, and D, but a change in the government revenue for the U.S. is C plus E, again, and then the change in foreign producer surplus, and what's happening for them, remember, they're the supply curve here, and we want to work with the original supply curve, because that's their original marginal cost of production. Their exports fall from 1 million to 800,000, right, falling to here. So they are now losing, right, and they're now receiving, right, what they're receiving is 285. So what they're left with, right, their producer surplus is this shaded area here, right? So they're losing E, and we have to add in an extra area here that we're labeling F. Okay, so it's probably a little bit hard to see. So we'll call this, and I'll just show it out here, we're labeling that lower half of the triangle F, and this upper part of the triangle here is our B and D, right? So what's going on in total here? So the foreign producers are actually losing, right? Not only are they losing this E, right, they're also losing F. So in terms of global welfare, right, so foreign producers are clearly worse off because they're losing all this surplus. In terms of the global welfare, and we said, right, that the domestically, right, that area C is just right, that's a net transfer from consumers to the government. And we said, on net for the U.S., it's E minus B and D, but that E is actually coming at the expense of foreign producers. So globally, the global deadweight loss is B, D, and F. Okay? It's even larger than just the deadweight loss components of what's happening in the U.S. So you can see, right, the U.S. is potentially gaining. If E, the terms of trade effect, is larger than the deadweight loss component, these areas B and D, U.S. welfare could actually improve. However, that's coming at the expense of our trading partners, because the exporters are clearly worse off. And we're imposing an even larger deadweight loss because of this distortion that we're having on global prices. So while these kinds of, right, these smaller tariffs, or even depending on how elastic export supply is, even more modestly sized tariffs, they could have a positive net impact on domestic welfare, but doing so comes at the expense of our trading partners and could cause problems such as retaliation. And this is what we'll talk about in more detail in class.